What if everything you've been taught about reality was just a beautifully woven distraction? Not a lie in the obvious sense, but a design, a veiled orchestration pulling you further from something ancient, something sacred, something that once belonged to you. They told you to silence the tremble in your spine, to dismiss the knowing in your gut, to explain away the moments when time bent and something deeper stirred. But that subtle ache, the one you feel when you look at the stars or touch someone you love, that was never confusion. It was memory, and that memory has brought you here. You didn't find this video by accident. Something inside you, older than language, quieter than thought, led you to this threshold. Because part of you remembers, and that part is ready to awaken. This is not information. This is initiation. So take a breath, let go of what you've been told, and open the space within you where truth has always waited. Your journey begins now. Most people go their entire lives never sensing it, never hearing its whisper, never feeling its presence move quietly within them. But once you do, once even a sliver of it awakens, nothing ever looks or feels the same again. At the base of your spine lies a force so primal, so ancient, that civilizations once bowed to its mystery. They called it Kundalini, coiled like a serpent, sleeping until the moment your soul is ready to remember. Not to discover, but to remember. Because this isn't something new. It's not a trend. It's the original inheritance, buried beneath shame, suppressed by systems, distorted by dogma. And perhaps that's why you were never told. Maybe that's why they replaced it with sermons about guilt and control. Because if you ever realized what lives inside your own spine, what power you carry, and what freedom it offers, you'd become impossible to govern. Kundalini is not just energy. It's not just spirituality in soft colors and vague affirmations. It is wild, intelligent, electrical consciousness in motion. When it stirs, it doesn't ask for permission. It unravels illusions. It purges what no longer belongs. It is destruction and rebirth in the same breath. And it doesn't care about your ego's comfort. That's what makes it sacred. They've taught us to fear the serpent. In religious texts, it's the deceiver. In media, it's the villain. But in the ancient temples of Egypt, the cobra crowned the foreheads of pharaohs. In tantric traditions, the serpent is revered as the spine's divine fire. What if the snake that lured humanity into sin wasn't evil, but was offering awakening? What if the exile from Eden wasn't punishment, but the beginning of a deeper journey home? Sex and spirituality were never meant to be enemies. That separation is recent, manufactured. When you treat your sexual energy as shameful, you close the very portal that could lead you to wholeness. But when you meet it with presence, breath, and reverence, it becomes something else entirely. Desire shifts into devotion. Touch becomes transmission. And the body, no longer objectified or repressed, becomes a living temple. Science is catching up. Neuroimaging of advanced meditators shows altered brainwave patterns, heightened gamma states, increased coherence between heart and brain. The vagus nerve, intimately linked to both sexual arousal and spiritual ecstasy, lights up under breath-based practices. What mystics knew intuitively, we now begin to verify biologically. The bridge between flesh and spirit is not symbolic. It's real, it's electrical, and it's accessible. But this isn't about mastering a technique or checking off steps on a list. Kundalini is not a performance. It's a surrender. A deep listening to what the body already knows but the mind forgot. And when it rises, you don't become more powerful in the worldly sense. You become more transparent, more honest, more awake. That's what threatens systems built on control. So no, you weren't broken. You weren't too sensitive, too wild, too much. You were simply never taught how sacred you actually are. Now that you know, the only real question is, will you remember? It wasn't enough to control your thoughts. They had to get inside your skin. You weren't just told what to think about your body. You were taught how to feel it. And that's the true prison. Not a physical chain, but a subtle, lingering discomfort inside your own flesh, like you were never quite safe being you. From a young age, you were trained to be suspicious of your own desire. The world around you dripped with sexual imagery, ads, music, media. But when you felt that same energy inside yourself, you were told it was dirty. You were given no map, no guide, only rules. Suppress, repent, distract. But never listen. This wasn't random. Systems built on obedience need your disconnection. If you're at war with your body, if you feel shame for your pleasure, you become easy to manipulate. Shame is the most efficient form of energetic theft because it convinces you to police yourself. You don't need to be watched when you've been taught to distrust your own longing. And this disconnection doesn't just rob you of joy. It dulls your power. We've heard from so many people who did all the right things, affirmations, vision boards, daily meditation, and still felt stuck, still empty, still exhausted. That's because they were working only with their thoughts, not their root energy. They were building a house without laying a foundation. True transformation doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body, specifically in the places we've been told to ignore. The hips, the womb, the spine, the breath that reaches into the belly. The places where memory lives. The places where shame was stored. And the systems knew this. That's why, over generations, they replaced initiations with indoctrinations. In ancient times, rites of passage used breath, sound, movement, and sacred touch to awaken what was dormant. These weren't hedonistic, they were holy. But as those traditions faded, they were rewritten as heresy. Sensuality was replaced with control. Ceremony was replaced with fear. Then came the commodification, your body as content, your pleasure as product. Porn didn't evolve from sacred sexuality. It evolved from capitalism's need to profit from your disconnection. It mimics the outer shape of intimacy while starving the soul of any true nourishment. And so many of us carry a strange wound, longing for union, yet afraid of touch, craving depth, yet stuck in surface-level connection. We live in a culture that exploits desire while shaming the desirer. That celebrates sexuality but never sanctifies it. This is not by accident. It is psychological warfare. The battlefield is within, and the first step to liberation is noticing the subtle messages that trained you to fear your own aliveness. Reclaiming your body is not a rebellion, it's a remembering. You don't need permission to be whole. You never did. Shame is a ghost that lives in your body. You don't see it, but you feel it. In the way your shoulders tighten when someone touches you, in the breath you hold when desire rises, in the quiet apologies you whisper to yourself after craving connection. But what if shame isn't the problem? What if it's just the symptom? The smoke from a fire that started long before you were born, when the body was declared a battlefield and the spirit was told it had to ascend by abandoning its flesh. You don't need to transcend your body. You need to come back into it. Every wound around your sexuality is not a moral flaw, it's an energetic misdirection. When pleasure is judged, the body learns to constrict. When arousal is feared, breath becomes shallow. And when desire is suppressed, power gets stagnant. Over time, this stagnation builds into confusion, numbness, or even despair. But here's the truth: that energy never leaves. It just waits, hidden, unexpressed, coiled. And the way back isn't through more control, it's through presence. There are practices older than any modern psychology that were designed to transmute this very energy. Breathwork that reaches deep into the diaphragm, loosening the grip of unconscious contraction. Mindful body meditation, where attention moves through forgotten places, hips, pelvis, chest, not to judge or fix, but simply to feel. And tantric touch, not as foreplay, but as prayer. Not as seduction, but as communion. These are not esoteric rituals for the few. They are birthrights. They are technologies of the soul. When practiced with sincerity, they don't just release tension. They restore sovereignty. You begin to realize that sexual energy isn't a distraction. It's a compass. When treated with reverence, it becomes fuel for insight, not indulgence. This is the art of sexual transmutation, redirecting raw instinct into creation, presence, clarity. Not denying desire, but upgrading its expression. Many people in the comments spoke of frustration, of doing all the spiritual work, yet feeling stuck. And that's because so much of modern spirituality bypasses the body. It forgets that the soul lives in the tissue, in the breath, in the trembling space between longing and love. The moment you stop judging your desire and start listening to it, something shifts. Not just in your body, but in your life. You stop leaking power. You stop chasing validation. And you begin to step outside the invisible walls that kept you small. This is not about becoming someone new. It's about reclaiming who you've always been, before the shame, before the fear, before the systems that convinced you to split yourself in two. Your sovereignty was never lost. It was buried under stories, under silence, under generations of forgetting. Now is the time to remember. We were never meant to treat sex as casual, not because it's sinful, but because it's sacred. There is a way of touching, a way of being that turns intimacy into prayer, where each glance becomes a mantra, each breath becomes an offering, and each movement is no longer about taking, but about remembering. This is devotional sex, not the kind that burns fast and fades, the kind that heals, the kind that reveals, the kind that reminds you what it means to come home to yourself through the body of another. In sacred union, desire is not a craving, it's a calling. The body is not a playground, it's a portal. At the heart of this union is polarity, the dance of divine masculine and divine feminine. These are not genders, but energetic archetypes, structures of consciousness that exist in all of us. The masculine holds space. The feminine flows. The masculine witnesses with presence. The feminine expresses with trust. When these two meet in balance, the body becomes more than just sensation. It becomes transmission, a vessel for something higher to enter. You don't need to believe in ancient philosophies to feel this, but those who came before us left maps. In the tantric path, there is Maithuna, the sacred act where two become one, not just in flesh but in essence. In Vajrayana Buddhism, Karma Mudra teaches how pleasure can dissolve ego and reveal emptiness. In Taoist cultivation, yin and yang are united in meditative practice to refine essence into spirit. These traditions were never about indulgence. They were disciplines of depth, rites of embodiment. And though they've been watered down or misused, their core remains unshaken. That sexuality, when honored, becomes revelation. The journey begins not with technique but with presence, with the courage to slow down, to feel not just the body of your partner, but your own. To notice the tremble beneath the touch, the breath behind the words, the stillness inside the motion. As you become more attuned, something awakens. The energy between you starts to move differently, less like fire and more like light. It rises up the spine, expands the heart, sharpens the mind. It doesn't deplete, it renews. This isn't about perfect choreography. It's about deep listening, about giving without losing, receiving without grasping, merging without disappearing. In a world that commodifies connection, sacred union is rebellion. In a culture obsessed with climax, it is an invitation to stay present, to stay open, to stay true. And in that staying, devotion is born, not to the other, but through the other, back to the divine within. Because in the end, sacred sex isn't about what you do. It's about what you remember, that your body was never separate from your soul, and that every time you love with presence, you are already home. You were never impure, never too much, never wrong for wanting what you wanted. You were simply uninitiated, fed stories that made you afraid of your own depth, your own fire, your own holiness. This journey is not about fixing what's broken. It's about waking up to what was buried. The shame you carried was never yours. The silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. And now you're being asked to shed it, not because you need to become someone else, but because who you truly are is ready to emerge. Your body has always known the way. It speaks in sensations, in longings, in the soft ache between your ribs when something true is finally named. It carries not just your trauma, but your wisdom. And healing doesn't come from escaping that body. It comes from listening to it, softly, steadily, lovingly. Begin small, with a breath that drops into your belly, a hand placed over your heart. A moment of stillness where you no longer try to change anything, but simply witness what is. That's where power lives. And if your sexual energy is sacred, if it is the same force that births galaxies and sparks awakening, then the real question is not whether you're worthy of it. The real question is, will you stop running from it? Will you meet it not with fear but with reverence? You are not here to shrink. You are not here to conform. You are here to remember, to re-inhabit your body as a temple, to reclaim your energy as your own. and to walk as someone who knows that intimacy with self, with other, with life is the portal to everything you've been seeking. In our next video, we'll go deeper into the actual techniques to awaken your Kundalini energy, even if you're just beginning. This is where the practice begins, where knowledge turns into embodiment, and where you stop seeking and start experiencing. Until then, stay with your breath, stay with your truth, and most of all, stay with yourself. Because you were never broken, just asleep. And now you're waking up.